Chapter 4. Jeserac was not very helpful, though he was not as uncooperative as Alvin had half expected. He had been asked such questions before in his long career as mentor, and did not believe that even a unique like Alvin could produce many surprises, or set him problems which he could not solve. It was true that Alvin was beginning to show certain minor eccentricities of behavior, which might eventually need correction. He did not join as fully as he should in the incredibly elaborate social life of the city or in the fantasy worlds of his companions. He showed no great interest in the higher realms of thought, though at his age that was hardly surprising. More remarkable was his erratic love life. He could not be expected to form any relatively stable partnerships for at least a century, yet the brevity of his affairs was already famous. They were intense while they lasted, but not one of them had lasted for more than a few weeks. Alvin, it seemed, could interest himself thoroughly only in one thing at a time. There were times when he would join wholeheartedly in the erotic games of his companions, or disappear with the partner of his choice for several days. But he seemed totally uninterested in what should have been a major occupation at his age. This was probably bad for him, and it was certainly bad for his discarded lovers, who wandered despondently around the city and took an unusually long time to find consolation elsewhere. Alystra, Jeserac had noticed, had now arrived at this unhappy stage. It was not that Alvin was heartless or inconsiderate. In love, as in everything else, it seemed that he was searching for a goal that Diaspar could not provide. None of these characteristics worried Jeserac. A unique might be expected to behave in such a manner, and, in due course, Alvin would conform to the general pattern of the city. No single individual, however eccentric or brilliant, could affect the enormous inertia of a city that had remained virtually unchanged for over 1 billion years. Jeserac did not merely believe in stability. He could conceive of nothing else. "The problem that worries you is a very old one," he told Alvin. "But you will be surprised how many people take the world so much for granted that it never bothers them or even crosses their mind. It is true that the human race once occupied an infinitely greater space than this city. You have seen something of what Earth was like before the deserts came and the oceans vanished. Those records you are so fond of projecting are the earliest we possess. They are the only ones that show Earth as it was before the invaders came. I do not imagine that many people have ever seen them. Those limitless open spaces are something we cannot bear to contemplate. And even Earth, of course, was only a grain of sand in the galactic empire. What the gulfs between the stars must have been like is a nightmare no sane man would try to imagine. Our ancestors crossed them at the dawn of history, when they went out to build the empire. They crossed them again for the last time, when the invaders drove them back to Earth. The legend is, and it is only a legend, that we made a pact with the invaders. They could have the universe if they needed it so badly. We would be content with the world on which we were born. We have kept that pact and forgotten the vain dreams of our childhoods, as you too will forget them, Alvin. The men who built this city and designed the society that went with it were lords of mind as well as matter. They put everything that the human race would ever need inside these walls, and then made sure that we would never leave them. Oh, the physical barriers are the least important ones. Perhaps there are routes that lead out of the city, but I do not think you would go along them for very far, even if you found them. And if you succeeded in the attempt, what good would it do? Your body would not last long in the desert, when the city could no longer protect or nourish it."
"If there is a route out of the city," Alvin said slowly, "then what is there to stop me from leaving?"
"That is a foolish question," answered Jeserac. "I think you already know the answer." Jeserac was right, but not in the way he imagined. Alvin knew, or rather, he had guessed. His companions had given him the answer, both in their waking life and in the dream adventures he had shared with them. They would never be able to leave Diaspar. What Jeserac did not know was that the compulsion which ruled their lives had no power over Alvin. Whether his uniqueness was due to accident or to an ancient design, he did not know, but this was one of its results. He wondered how many others he had yet to discover. No one had ever hurried in Diaspar, and this was a rule which even Alvin seldom broke. He considered the problem carefully for several weeks, and spent much time searching the earliest of the city's historical memories. For hours on end, he would lie, supported by the impalpable arms of an anti-gravity field, while the hypnone projector opened his mind to the past. When the record was finished, the machine would blur and vanish. But still, Alvin would lie staring into nothingness before he came back through the ages to meet reality again. He would see again the endless leagues of blue water, vaster than the land itself, rolling their waves against golden shores. His ears would ring with the boom of breakers stilled these billion years. He would remember the forests and the prairies and the strange beasts that had once shared the world with man. Very few of these ancient records existed. It was generally accepted, though none knew the reason why, that somewhere between the coming of the invaders and the building of Diaspar, all memories of primitive times had been lost. So complete had been the obliteration that it was hard to believe it could have happened by accident alone. Mankind had lost its past, save for a few chronicles that might be wholly legendary. Before Diaspar, there was simply the Dawn Ages. In that limbo were merged inextricably together the first men to tame fire and the first to release atomic energy, the first men to build a log canoe, and the first to reach the stars. On the far side of this desert of time, they were all neighbors. Alvin had intended to take this trip alone once more, but solitude was not always something that could be arranged in Diaspar. He had barely left his room when he encountered Alystra, who made no attempt to pretend that her presence was accidental. It had never occurred to Alvin that Alystra was beautiful, for he had never seen human ugliness. When beauty is universal, it loses its power to move the heart, and only its absence can produce any emotional effect. For a moment, Alvin was annoyed by the meeting, with its reminder of passions that no longer moved him. He was still too young and self-reliant to feel the need for any lasting relationships, and when the time came, he might find it hard to make them. Even in his most intimate moments, the barrier of his uniqueness came between him and his lovers. For all his fully formed body, he was still a child, and would remain so for decades yet, while his companions, one by one, recalled the memories of their past lives and left him far behind. He had seen it happen before, and it made him wary of giving himself unreservedly to any other person. Even Alystra, who seemed so naive and artless now, would soon become a complex of memories and talents beyond his imagination. His mild annoyance vanished almost at once. There was no reason why Alystra should not come with him, if she desired. He was not selfish, and did not wish to clutch this new experience to his bosom like a miser. Indeed, he might be able to learn much from her reactions. She asked no questions, which was unusual, as the express channel swept them out of the crowded heart of the city. Together, they worked their way to the central high-speed section, never bothering to glance at the miracle beneath their feet. An engineer of the ancient world would have gone slowly mad trying to understand how an apparently solid roadway could be fixed at the sides, while towards the center it moved at a steadily increasing velocity. But to Alvin and Alystra, it seemed perfectly natural that types of matter should exist that had the properties of solids in one direction and of liquids in another. Around them, the buildings rose higher and higher, as if the city was strengthening its bulwarks against the outer world. How strange it would be, thought Alvin, if these towering walls became as transparent as glass, and one could watch the life within. Scattered throughout the space around him were friends he knew, friends he would one day know, and strangers he would never meet, though there could be very few of these, since
In the course of his lifetime, he would meet almost all of the people in Diaspar. Most of them would be sitting in their separate rooms, but they would not be alone. They had only to form the wish, and they could be, in all but physical fact, in the presence of any other person they chose. They were not bored, for they had access to everything that happened in the realms of imagination or reality since the days when the city was built. To men whose minds were thus constituted, it was completely satisfying existence. That it was also a wholly futile one, even Alvin did not yet comprehend. As Alvin and Alystra moved outward from the city's heart, the number of people they saw in the streets slowly decreased, and there was no one in sight when they were brought to a smooth halt against a long platform of brightly colored marble. They stepped across the frozen whirlpool of matter, where the substance of the moving way flowed back to its original, and faced a wall pierced with brightly lighted tunnels. Alvin selected one without hesitation and stepped into it, with Alystra close behind. The peristaltic field seized them at once and propelled them forward as they lay back luxuriously, watching their surroundings. It no longer seemed possible that they were in a tunnel far underground. The art that had used all of Diaspar for its canvas had been busy here, and above them the skies seemed open to the winds of heaven. All around were the spires of the city, gleaming in the sunlight. It was not the city that Alvin knew, but the Diaspar of a much earlier age. Although most of the great buildings were familiar, there were subtle differences that added to the interest of the scene. Alvin wished he could linger, but he had never found any way of retarding his progress through the tunnel. All too soon, they would set gently down in a large elliptical chamber, completely surrounded by windows. Through these, they could catch tantalizing glimpses of gardens ablaze with brilliant flowers. There were gardens still in Diaspar, but these had existed only in the mind of the artist who conceived them. Certainly, there were no such flowers as these in the world today. Alystra was enchanted by their beauty, and was obviously under the impression that this is what Alvin had brought her to see. He watched her for a while, as she ran gaily from scene to scene, enjoying her delight in each new discovery. There were hundreds of such places in the half-deserted buildings around the periphery of Diaspar, kept in perfect order by the hidden powers which watched over them. One day, the tide of life might flow this way once more, but until then, this ancient garden was a secret which they alone shared. "We've further to go," said Alvin at last. "This is only the beginning." He stepped through one of the windows, and the illusion was shattered. There was no garden behind the glass, but a circular passageway curving steeply upward. He could still see Alystra a few feet away, though he knew that she could not see him. But she did not hesitate, and a moment later was standing beside him in the passage. Beneath their feet, the floor began to creep slowly forward, as if eager to lead them to their goal. They walked along it for a few paces, until their speed was so great that further effort would be wasted. The corridor still inclined upward, and in 100 feet had curved through a complete right angle. But only logic knew this. To all the senses, it was as if one was now being hurried along an absolutely level corridor. The fact that they were in reality moving straight up a vertical shaft thousands of feet deep gave them no sense of insecurity, for a failure of the polarizing field was unthinkable. Presently, the corridor began to slope downward again, until once more it had turned through a right angle. The movement of the floor slowed imperceptibly until it came to rest at the end of a long hall lined with mirrors. And Alvin knew that there was no hope of hurrying Alystra here. It was not merely that some feminine characteristics had survived unchanged since Eve. No one could have resisted the fascination of this place. There was nothing like it, as far as Alvin knew, in the rest of Diaspar. Through some whim of the artist, only a few of the mirrors reflected the scene as it really was, and even those, Alvin was convinced, were constantly changing their position. The rest certainly reflected something, but it was faintly disconcerting to see oneself walking amid ever-changing and quite imaginary surroundings. Sometimes there were people going to and fro in the world behind the mirror, And more than once, Alvin had seen faces that he recognized. He realized well enough that he had not been looking at any friends he knew in this existence. Through the mind of the unknown artist, he had been seeing into the past, watching the previous incarnations of people who walked the world today. It saddened him, by reminding him of his own uniqueness, to think that however long he waited before these changing scenes, he would never meet any ancient echo of himself. "Do you know where we are?" Alvin asked Alystra when they had completed the tour of the mirrors. Alystra shook her head. "Somewhere near the edge of the city, I suppose," she answered carelessly. "We seem to have gone a long way, but I've no idea how far." "We're in the Tower of Loran," replied Alvin. "This is one of the highest points in Diaspar. Come, I'll show you." He caught Alystra's hand and led her out of the hall. There were no exits visible to the eye, but at various points, the pattern on the floor indicated side corridors. As one approached the mirrors at these points, the reflections seemed to fuse into an archway of light, and one could step through into another passage. Alystra lost all conscious track of their twistings and turnings, and at last, they emerged into a long, perfectly straight tunnel through which blew a cold and steady wind. It stretched horizontally for hundreds of feet in either direction, and its far ends were tiny circles of light. "I don't like this place," Alystra complained. "It's cold." She had probably never before experienced real coldness in her life, and Alvin felt somewhat guilty. He should have warned her to bring a cloak, and a good one, for all clothes in Diaspar were purely ornamental and quite useless as a protection. Since her discomfort was entirely his fault, he handed over his cloak without a word. There was no trace of gallantry in this. The equality of the sexes had been complete for far too long for such conventions to survive. Had matters been the other way around, Alystra would have given Alvin her cloak, and he would have as automatically accepted. It was not unpleasant walking with the wind behind them, and they soon reached the end of the tunnel. A wide-meshed filigree of stone prevented them from going further, which was just as well, for they stood on the brink of nothingness. The great air duct opened on the sheer face of the tower, and below them there was a vertical drop of at least 1,000 feet. They were high upon the outer ramparts of the city, and Diaspar lay spread beneath them, as few in their world could ever have seen it. The view was the averse of the one that Alvin had obtained from the center of the park. He could look down upon the concentric waves of stone and metal as they descended in mile-long sweeps toward the heart of the city. Far away, partly hidden by the intervening towers, he could glimpse the distant fields and trees and the eternally circling river. Further still, the remoter bastions of Diaspar climbed once more towards the sky. Behind him, Alystra was sharing the view with pleasure, but with no surprise. She had seen the city countless times before from other, almost equally well-placed vantage points, and in considerably more comfort. "That's our world. All of it," said Alvin. "Now I want to show you something else." He turned away from the grating and began to walk towards the distant circle of light in the far end of the tunnel. The wind was cold against his lightly clad body, but he scarcely noticed the discomfort as he walked forward into the airstream. He had gone only a little way when he realized that Alystra was making no attempt to follow. She stood watching, her borrowed cloak streaming down the wind, one hand half raised to her face. Alvin saw her lips move, but the words did not reach him. He looked back at first with astonishment, then with an impatience that was not totally devoid of pity. What Jeserac had said was true. She could not follow him. She had realized the meaning of that remote circle of light from which the wind blew forever into Diaspar. Behind Alystra was the known world, full of wonder yet empty of surprise, drifting like a brilliant but tightly closed bubble down the river of time. Ahead, separated from her by no more than the span of a few footsteps, was the empty wilderness, the world of the desert, the world of the invaders. Alvin walked back to join her, and was surprised to find that she was trembling. "Why are you frightened?" he asked. "We're still safe here in Diaspar. You've looked out of that window behind us. Surely you can look out of this one as well." Alystra was staring at him as if he was some strange monster. By her standards, indeed, he was. "I couldn't do it," she said at last. "Even thinking about it makes me feel colder than this wind. Don't go any farther, Alvin." "But there's no logic in it," Alvin persisted remorselessly. "What possible harm would it do to walk to the end of this corridor and look out? It's strange and lonely out there, but it isn't horrible. In fact, the longer I look, the more beautiful I think—" Alystra did not stay to hear him finish. She turned on her heels and fled back down the long ramp that had brought them up through the hole of this tunnel. Alvin made no attempt to stop her, since that would have involved the bad manners of imposing one's will upon another. Persuasion, he could see, would have been totally useless. He knew that Alystra would not pause until she had returned to her companions. There was no danger that she would lose herself in the labyrinths of the city, for she would have no difficulty in retracing her footsteps. An instinctive ability to extricate himself from even the most complex of mazes had been merely one of the many accomplishments man had learned since he had started to live in cities. The long-extinct rat had been forced to acquire similar skills when he left the fields and threw in his lot with humanity. Alvin waited for a moment, as if half expecting Alystra to return. He was not surprised at her reaction, only at its violence and irrationality. Though he was sincerely sorry that she had gone, he could not help wishing that she had remembered to leave the cloak. It was not only cold, but it was also hard work moving against the wind which sighed through the lungs of the city. Alvin was fighting both the air current and whatever force it was that kept it moving. Not until he had reached the stone grill and could lock his arms around its bars could he afford to relax. There was just sufficient room for him to force his head through the opening, and even so, his view was slightly restricted, as the entrance to the duct was partly recessed into the city's wall. Yet he could see enough. Thousands of feet below, the sunlight was taking leave of the desert. The almost horizontal rays struck through the grating and threw a weird pattern of golden shadow far down the tunnel. Alvin shaded his eyes against the glare and peered down at the land upon which no man had walked for unknown ages. He might have been looking at an eternally frozen sea. For mile after mile, the sand dunes undulated into the west, their contours grossly exaggerated by the slanting light. Here and there, some caprice of the wind had curved curious whirlpools and gullies into the sand, so that it was sometimes hard to realize that none of this sculpture was the work of intelligence. At a very great distance, so far away indeed that he had no way of judging their remoteness, was a range of softly rounded hills. They had been a disappointment to Alvin. He would have given much to have seen in reality the soaring mountains of the ancient records and his own dreams. The sun lay upon the rim of the hills, its light tamed and reddened by the hundreds of miles of atmosphere it was traversing. There were 2 great black spots upon its disk. Alvin had learned from his studies that such things existed, but he was surprised that he could see them so easily. They seemed almost like a pair of eyes peering back at him, as he crouched in his lonely spy hole, with the wind whistling ceaselessly past his ears. There was no twilight. With the going of the sun, the pools of shadow lying among the sand dunes flowed swiftly together in one vast lake of darkness. Color ebbed from the sky. The warm reds and golds drained away, leaving an Antarctic blue that deepened and deepened into night. Alvin waited for that breathless moment that he alone of all mankind had known, the moment when the first star shivered into life. It had been many weeks since he had last come to this place, and he knew that the pattern of the night sky must have changed meanwhile. Even so, he was not prepared for his first glimpse of the 7 suns. They could have no other name. The phrase leaped unbidden to his lips. They formed a tiny, very compact and astonishingly symmetrical group against the afterglow of sunset. 6 of them were arranged in a slightly flattened ellipse, which, Alvin was sure, was in reality a perfect circle, slightly tilted toward the line of vision. Each star was a different color. He could pick out red, blue, gold, and green. but the other tints eluded his eye. At the precise center of the formation was a single white giant, the brightest star in all the visible sky. The whole group looked exactly like a piece of jewelry. It seemed incredible, and beyond all stretching of the laws of chance, that nature could ever have contrived so perfect a pattern. As his eyes grew slowly accustomed to the darkness, Alvin could make out the great misty veil that had once been called the Milky Way. It stretched from the zenith down to the horizon, and the 7 suns were entangled in its folds. The other stars had now emerged to challenge them, and their random groupings only emphasized the enigma of that perfect symmetry. It was almost as if some power had deliberately opposed the disorder of the natural universe by setting its sign upon the stars. 10 times, no more, the galaxy had turned upon its axis since man first walked on Earth. By its own standards, that was but a moment. Yet in that short period, it had changed completely. Changed far more than it had any right to do in the natural course of events. The great suns that had once burned so fiercely in the pride of youth were now guttering to their doom. But Alvin had never seen the heavens in their ancient glory, and so was unaware of all that had been lost. The cold, seeping through into his bones, drove him back to the city. He extricated himself from the grating and rubbed the circulation back into his limbs. Ahead of him, down the tunnel, the light streaming out from Diaspar was so brilliant that for a moment he had to avert his eyes. Outside the city, there were such things as day and night, but within it, there was only eternal day. As the sun descended, the sky above Diaspar would fill with light, and no one would notice when the natural illumination vanished. Even before men had lost the need for sleep, they had driven darkness from their cities. The only night that ever came to Diaspar was a rare and unpredictable obscuration that sometimes visited the park and transformed it into a place of mystery. Alvin came slowly back through the Hall of Mirrors, his mind still filled with night and stars. He felt inspired, and yet depressed. There seemed no way in which he could ever escape out into that enormous emptiness, and no rational purpose in doing so. Jeserac had said that a man would soon die out in the desert, and Alvin could well believe him. Perhaps he might one day discover some way of leaving Diaspar, but if he did, he knew that he must soon return. To reach the desert would be an amusing game, no more. It was a game he could share with no one, and it would lead him nowhere. But at least it would be worth doing it if it helped to quench the longing in his soul. As if unwilling to return to the familiar world, Alvin lingered among the reflections from the past. He stood before one of the great mirrors and watched the scenes that came and went within its depths. Whatever mechanism produced these images was controlled by his presence, and, to some extent, by his thoughts. The mirrors were always blank when he first came into the room, but filled with action as soon as he moved among them. He seemed to be standing in a large open courtyard, which he had never seen in reality, but which probably still existed somewhere in Diaspar. It was unusually crowded, and some kind of public meeting seemed to be in progress. 2 men were arguing politely on a raised platform, while their supporters stood around and made interjections from time to time. The complete silence added to the charm of the scene, for imagination immediately went to work supplying the missing sounds. What were they debating? Alvin wondered. Perhaps it was not a real scene from the past, but a purely created episode. The careful balance of figures, the slightly formal movements, all made it seem a little too neat for life. He studied the faces in the crowd, seeking for anyone he could recognize. There was no one here that he knew, but he might be looking at friends he would not meet for centuries to come. How many possible patterns of human physiognomy were there? The number was enormous, but it was still finite, especially when all the unaesthetic variations had been eliminated. The people in the mirror world would continue their long-forgotten argument, ignoring the image of Alvin which stood motionless among them. Sometimes it was all very hard to believe that he was not part of the scene himself, for the illusion was so flawless. When one of the phantoms in the mirror appeared to move behind Alvin, it vanished just as a real object would have done, and when one moved in front of him, He was the one who was eclipsed. He was preparing to leave when he noticed an oddly dressed man standing a little apart from the main group. His movements, his clothes, everything about him seemed slightly out of place in this assembly. He spoiled the pattern. Like Alvin, he was an anachronism. He was a good deal more than that. He was real, and he was looking at Alvin with a slightly quizzical smile.